Hmm. You guys can hear now? Okay, that was weird. I muted it and unmuted it and it fixed it. So awesome. All right, I will start over then. So for any lip readers out there, I guess you'll have to hear this twice. Okay, so welcome to Lambda School's Introduction to Web Development. My name is Deandra Ryan Moss. This is night 2 out of 8 of this 8-night course. So last night we talked about just some basics of what is web development, what is computer programming, and then I introduced you guys to HTML, the first language that we're going to be learning in this course. So tonight we don't have to do as much housekeeping stuff, so there's a lot more time for programming. We're going to go over what we saw with HTML and then learn a little bit more, a couple more advanced elements in HTML. And then we're going to switch focus over to CSS, which is another language that's key to front-end web development. So before I go any further, I want to talk to you guys a little bit about Lambda School, and then we'll jump into it. So for anyone who does not know, Lambda School is a completely online computer science and web development immersive. So over the course of 6 months, we teach you guys how to become web developers. We take you from a close to beginning point to the point where you are ready to go out there in the field and be hired into a full-time job. And we are so certain that you will be ready for that full-time job that we actually have a what's called a deferred tuition model. So this is something that makes Lambda School really unique. We do not require you to pay anything upfront. So by that, I literally mean 0 tuition upfront. So you can be entirely paid back, or you will entirely pay Lambda School back for your tuition only after you are hired into that full-time job. So, and I think that somebody, maybe Mitchell, it has their sound on. So sorry, I'm going to pause my little conversation to, thank you for muting. All right. Sorry about that. We're getting all sorts of derailed tonight. So, so the deferred tuition model, it means that you do not start paying your tuition until you are completely done with the course and actually hired. So there is 0 risk of you going through and forking out a bunch of money and not getting hired because you only pay for Lambda School after you get that job. So beyond the basics of what Lambda School is and what we teach, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about who Lambda School is for. This is a very relevant topic if you're considering joining Lambda School. So I'm going to start by saying who it's not for, or more specifically, what we don't want to care about. One of the first things is we don't want Lambda School to only be for rich people. That was really important to the people who started Lambda School. So that is why we have that deferred tuition model. We want it to be available to people regardless of if they have, $20,000 sitting around or not, because let's be real, most of us do not have $20,000 just sitting around. Another thing is that Lambda School is not necessarily for people who have backgrounds in computer science. Some people do, many people do not. You don't need to have a background in engineering, CS, math, or anything like that. In fact, you don't even need to have a college degree. We want to teach you everything you need to know. So we're expecting you to put some hard work in, of course, during the program and during this pre-course, but that doesn't mean you need to have a degree in computer science or a bunch of computer science experience. So the idea is that we want the door open to as many people as possible. And we have people from all walks of life coming in. Like I said, some people do have that background. Some people have programming experience, but not web development experience. Some people don't have much experience at all. So who is Lambda School for then? Well, it's for people who are extremely dedicated to learning. That is really our main criteria, is that we want to see that you are dedicated to putting in lots of hard work to learn this stuff. Because while we don't need you to come in with much knowledge or experience, we need you to work your butt off while you're in Lambda School. So in the spirit of that, a lot of the interview process when you're applying for Lambda School is really centered around that, where we do have a little challenge that you have to complete. We do have a little challenge that you have to complete in order to even get your interview, but past that point, we're mostly interested in how dedicated you are to learning, not what you already know. So there is a little bit, more about Lambda School. Each night I'll be talking to you a little bit more and giving you a little window into a different piece of it. But let's go ahead and switch gears and talk about what we're learning tonight, which is more front-end web development. So as I mentioned, we'll be talking both about HTML and CSS tonight. And those are two key languages in terms of front-end web development. So as we discussed last night, web development is all about creating content for the web, creating websites, web apps, etc. And in order to do that, one of the starting points is the appearance. How does it look? How does it display? And HTML and CSS are both markup languages that are designed for creating web content. So as a reminder, markup languages, you can't really execute logic or complex scripts like you could in a programming language. They're designed more just to render, to display things. So, and specifically those two languages are designed to display web content. So I'll be sharing my screen in just a second to talk about the differences between those two. But I will say right now that we did talk a little bit about this last night, so I want you guys to actually pipe in on this. So as far as the differences between HTML and CSS, who can throw out in the chat channel a couple of differences between those two? Anything you've got, if you want to even make a guess, go for it. So, okay, I see CSS is for styling content. I see HTML is building materials. CSS is the paint. I like that a lot. So I'm guessing what you mean by that is this idea of maybe you build a house and you say, okay, a wall goes here and a wall goes here, but then you put the paint on top to actually display how it looks. Okay, cool. Yep. So we've got HTML marks up the content and CSS styles the appearance. And then I see someone even threw in something about JavaScript. JavaScript is the magic. Yes, very good explanation of JavaScript as well. Awesome. It sounds like you guys have a good idea of the difference between the two. So let me share my screen and we'll re-look at one of the examples I showed you last night just to drive that point home. All right. So over here we have, hold on. Let me get my chat over here. Okay, so over here we have a very simple web page that I showed you guys from last night. And there is a little bit of HTML on here, a little bit of CSS, and some JavaScript, though we're mostly going to be ignoring JavaScript for tonight. So as you guys mentioned already, the HTML puts the content on the page and the CSS styles it. So for example, the fact that there is a header here that says web page, that's HTML. The fact that it is in this fancy scripty font is CSS. This box that everything's contained in, which you guys might guess is a div, is created using HTML. But the fact that the box has a blue background or a black border around it is all CSS. And so we don't just have to look at the website itself to tell the difference. We can very much look at the code as well and see that. So here's the code base up here. And we can look at these two different files. I'll actually pull them. Let me pull them out so we can look at them next to each other. 1 second. And we can see just from looking at these two that clearly we're working with different languages. So I talked a lot about syntax last night, and syntax is this idea of that every code has kind of different rules for how we construct it and put it together. Different types of brackets, different word orders, different keywords, things like that. And we can see that while between these two languages, there's some overlap. We can see that there's div elements here and div elements here, h1 here, etc. There's clearly syntactically some differences. So just from the get-go, it's pretty clear that we're working with two different languages. But don't worry right now about knowing the details of the syntax in CSS, because I will cover that later in tonight's lesson. So the big takeaway right now is that just from looking at the code, we can already tell we're working with a different language. So what happens if I comment out my CSS code? And by the way, commenting out is, every language has a syntax for commenting out, and that just means that the code is ignored. When the file is read, everything in the comment is treated as if it does not exist. So in CSS, we can see that we use a slash and a star to comment things out. So right now the CSS is missing. So when I refresh my page, we can see just the HTML on its own. All the content is still there, but the style is now gone. So let's bring that back real quick, save it, and refresh. Now we have it styled. So there's a nice little dynamic example of the difference between HTML and CSS. So that's a little primer for you guys for what's headed here tonight. We're going to put CSS away for now, go over some of the things we covered last night with HTML, and then I'll teach you a few other HTML elements. So let me hop on over to CodePen and we can start coding. So you guys learned last night all about the div elements, which is used to group other like elements together. For example, if we had a header, maybe this says, we'll do H3, night 1. And then down here we might have a paragraph that says, we learned about programming and some HTML. And then maybe we want another div. And I'm going to do a little copying and pasting here because I am lazy. And now we can do night 2. So there you go, just a little CS or a little HTML to represent some of the topics that we covered last night and we'll be covering tonight. So let's talk about what I've put on here. Well, I've created these div elements, and I'll do a little CSS down here, which you don't have to worry about yet. There we go. Sorry, I'm gonna do one more thing. Don't mind me. Cool. So now we can clearly see where our divs actually exist. So I've created 2 divs, little containers for our other elements. Inside of those, I've created a H3 and a paragraph inside of each. So an H3 is the 3rd most important header size, followed by a paragraph that contains some text. And there was one more element that we talked about last night, and that was the span. So if we wanted to highlight the word HTML wherever it appeared, we could put it inside of a span. And then I'll just copy that down here. So as a reminder, a span is kind of like a div in that it's sort of a default invisible container. But whereas a div is more intended to group larger like items together, a span is generally used inline for things like words or phrases that we want to highlight. So I've now put both of the times I say the language HTML, I've put them in a span. By default, we can't see that on the screen, but if I go over and do another little bit of CSS magic down here, then we can see where our span appears. And don't worry about the CSS just yet. We'll go into all the detail about what I'm doing down there once we finish with our HTML stuff. So up here, I have a few different examples of all 4 of the elements you learned last night. As a reminder, syntax is super important. So the basic syntax form for HTML is pretty simple. We start out with a tag name, something like H3, and we create an opening tag. So that's just the name of the element inside 2 brackets. Once we've created that, we can put whatever we want inside of it. We can put in text, we could put in other elements, and then when we're done, we close it out. So the most important thing here is to remember that we open our tags and we close them. The closing tag looks almost exactly the same as an opening tag, except it has that backslash. The other important thing to keep in mind when you're making HTML is that these tag names have to be precise. So you can only use the official element names that are built into the language. I couldn't type out the word header or type out division because the language expects div and it expects H3. So we have to know what those are. Fortunately, we don't have to have them all memorized because we can always Google it. And I'll even show you a master list of all those in just a minute here. So, oh, and I'm so sorry, / not backslash. I always get those mixed up. I apologize. All right, so it is a / not a backslash. I will make sure I say that right in the future. Thank you, guys. Okay, so that's a little review of what we saw last night. The only other thing I want to mention about this code is the idea of white space and tabbing. So from the computer's perspective, white space doesn't matter. I could squish all of this on one line and the computer would not care. However, if I kept doing that, it pretty quickly would get unreadable. So because we are humans and we work with other humans, we need to write human readable code. And we do that by following some spacing and tabbing conventions. For example, when I created these new elements that are on a new line, and there's kind of some wrapping happening here, so let me pull this over to give you a clear idea. So when I've created these two new elements that are inside of the div, notice that I started a new line and tabbed over. This lets us clearly see that these are contained within our div. As far as tabbing and white space goes, it'll take a little bit of time to get used to the conventions. So I urge you to look, back over the videos or look at code examples online so that you can get a clear idea of where you're supposed to be tabbing. For example, I haven't tabbed over the span because it's in line. Sometimes I've seen spans actually on their own line and tabbed over, but for me personally, I think that makes it look less readable. So anyways, that's a little bit about white space, and we'll be talking about different white space tabbing new line conventions in different languages as we learn more and more. So let's go ahead and talk about a couple new elements. I want to introduce you guys tonight to images, anchors, which are links, and lists. So each of these are a little more complex than what we've seen so far, but not too bad. So we'll go over each of them in time. So let's go ahead and create a new div down here, and I'll put an image in it. So let's give it an H5. All right, so the image tag is IMG. So once again, that needs to be precise. You can't spell out the word image or it won't work. However, there is something just from the get-go that's already different about this image tag from the other ones you've seen. And that's the fact that it is self-closing. So instead of creating an opening tag and a closing tag, I'm actually able to put the slash in at the end and close it within itself. So the short answer for why I'm allowed to do that is because images can't contain any content. You couldn't put another HTML element inside of it, so or text inside of it. So there's no need to open it and then close it. You can just do that in one fell swoop. So this is what's called a self-closing tag. It's the only one we're going to learn, but there are some others. So as you might have noticed, this image isn't very interesting because there's no image. So how do we add an image? Well, we add an image using something called an attribute. Some tags have attributes built in. Sometimes they're optional, sometimes they're required. With image, there's a required attribute called source, which is spelled SRC. So attributes look like this. Right after the opening tag, you write out the name of the attribute, which is going to be something that's built into the language, followed by an equal sign, followed by a pair of quotes. And then what's actually in the quotes will depend on the attributes. In the case of an image source, it's exactly what it sounds like. We want the source of whatever image we want to put in here. So, so what do I mean by source? Well, I can mean a couple different things. When we're working inside of a code base, it might be a link to an image that's in your file structure. So your code base could contain an image, in which case you could just link in that image from your file structure. And that's how you would want to do it if you were working with a real code base. But for the purposes of working in CodePen, you will probably just use the URL of an image. So what you do to find an image source is I'll actually show you on this. So just find any image online, right click on it and say copy image address. I'm not actually going to use this image, but I wanted to show you that. So I have a image address saved off screen that I'm going to grab over. So, oops. So there is an image address of an image online. And Pixum is a great tool if you want to just find a bunch of free stock photos. So there you go. I've now put in the source and we can see that our image is displaying. So yay, we successfully put an image in here. So not too different from the other tags that you've seen. The biggest two takeaways here are that some elements are going to be self-closing, like this one. And the syntax for that is you just put your / at the end. And the other takeaway is that you can put attributes on your tags. And attributes are sometimes required, like source. And you put the attribute name followed by an equal sign, followed by whatever content you need. In the case of an image, it's going to be a URL or a path to a picture that exists locally. So there is an image for you guys. I am actually going to get rid of it now because CodePen reloads so often that sometimes keeping the image up will lag the video a little bit, and I don't want you guys to miss me mixing up backslashes and forward slashes and saying other ridiculous things. So I'm going to get rid of this, but you can find many image examples online if you just Google. So, all right, we're done with that. Let's do a link example next. So links are what we call anchor tags. Why they called them anchors instead of links, I do not know. But it is an anchor tag, and we use just an A on its own. So we have now created an opening tag and a closing tag for a link. So, and I'm going to link to Lambda's website. So I'll put text inside it for Lambda School. All right, so you might have noticed that this doesn't look very functional. We have our anchor tag, both opening and closing. We have Lambda School, but it's not clickable, and nowhere in the code have we specified where it's supposed to go. You might have guessed that this is another situation where we are required to use an attribute. And the attribute is slightly different. It is href. So very common point of confusion for people who are new to HTML is mixing up href and source. If you do that, don't be hard on yourself. Everyone does that at the beginning. Pretty soon you'll be doing it in your sleep, but remember, if it's not working, you might have the wrong attribute, so just Google it. So href is our attribute for an anchor tag. And just like with the image, we will be copying over a URL. So I'm going to copy over Lambda School's URL, post this in here, and now look, by default, this link text has appeared in blue, kind of blue-purple, and it's underlined, and it's cueing to all of us, oh, hey, this is a link. We can click on it. So we click on it. Ta-da, Lambda School pops up. It's kind of weird in CodePen because to get there's no go back button, so you just kind of have to change something, anything arbitrary, and it'll reappear. So if you want to avoid the annoyance of that with your link, I'm going to show you one other attribute that's pretty useful. And this is called the target attribute. So target, and I'm going to set it equal to _blank. So when you set the target attribute equal to _blank, that says open this in a new window. So bam, now it opened Lambda School's site, and my CodePen is still there. So you might have noticed already as a web user that sometimes when you click a link, it redirects you from the page you're on, and sometimes it pops up a new tab. That is all about target blank. So now, because you guys are no longer thinking just like web users, you're thinking like web developers, whenever you're using the web and click on a link, take just a little moment to ask yourself, is target equal to blank or is it not? Which means, does the page open in a new tab or does it just redirect me? And now you have a little insight into what's going on behind the scenes when that happens. So that's the basics of using an anchor tag. Once again, not too different from anything you've seen so far. It just requires this href attribute, and there's also an optional target attribute that you might use to open things in a new window. So there's a link for you. The last thing I want to introduce you to are lists. And lists are a little bit weird because they're actually built out of multiple HTML elements. So they're a little different in that you actually need multiple HTML elements to create them. So let me create, I'm going to copy this over and create a list example for you. So we'll for some reason, my default is always to make a list of fruit. I need to come up with some other weird things to make lists of. For anyone who's taking this class for the second time and is sick of me talking about random fruits. Okay, so let's make a fruit list. And there are two different types of lists we can create, ordered lists and unordered lists. A fruit list would probably be unordered unless you are ranking fruits, which, you know, if you want to rank fruits, I won't hold it against you. But we're going to do an unordered list. So to create an unordered list, you start out with a UL element. As you might have guessed, that stands for unordered list. So I just opened that and closed that. But now within it, I need to create what are called list items, or LI. So for each item on my list, I need a new LI. So we could do mango. Oops, let's do an opening tag. Banana. Peach, etc. So we have, let's do actually grapes. So there is a list of 4 fruits for you. So we have just created our fruit list. So once again, the big takeaway here is that you need 2 elements. So you start out with a UL to just open the list up, and then within it, you create a new LI for every item on your list. So now let's talk about an ordered list. Ordered lists are pretty similar, but there's just one little difference. So I'm gonna, once again, copy and paste over. We'll call this our to-do list. And this one's gonna be ordered because I want my to-do list to be ranked in order of importance. And this one's an ordered list, so I use the OL elements instead. Notice that by default, the unordered list has bullet points, whereas the ordered list has numbers. First thing on my to-do list is fix my roof. No good. Roof leaks are not good. Next thing I need to do is get an Arizona driver's license because I can't vote otherwise. And democracy, yay. What else? I need to eat the tomatoes from my garden. That's pretty important. And then the last thing I need to do on my to-do list is hang up some shelves. I have some shelves that I bought on Amazon that are sitting in my closet. So there we go. That's, now you guys have a little insight into my weird life. It involves leaky roofs and garden tomatoes. So there you go. That's my to-do list for you in order. And once again, really similar in that you're required to have 2 elements. You open and close it with the OL, and then you have an LI for every item on the list. So there you go. Those are all the things I'm going to teach you for HTML. So those are just a couple HTML elements. And as I've said before, your job as an engineer or as a software developer is not to have all of these memorized, because there are a lot. In fact, I have the list right here. See everything in the sidebar? That's a lot. That is a lot of elements there. My gosh. I don't know anyone who has all these memorized. Somewhere out there, someone has these all memorized, but you probably shouldn't waste your brain space with that. Just learn the basics, and you will naturally learn them as you go along. And then whenever you need to do something new, look it up. The documentation is here for you to use. And just as a note, MDN is a really great resource for just basic references. So if you want some basic syntax, if you need to remember, is it IMG or IMAGE, just look up on MDN. If you want a more in-depth explanation, I would recommend either rewatching where I explained on this video, or maybe trying to find a blog post or another YouTube video. But for just the basic syntax, MDN is a really great place to start. So you can see several MDN tabs are open here. I'll be referring to it a lot today. So that is HTML for you guys. I'm going to, there's a lot of random stuff on here. Let's get rid of some of it so our screen isn't quite so busy once we go into CSS. Okay, so now it is time for CSS. So CSS, which stands for Cascading Style Sheets, is the language we use to style. So I've thrown in just a little bit of CSS here to give us a border and to highlight our spans so that it's clear what in the world is going on with our divs and spans, but we're gonna do a lot more than that tonight. So let me do a little kind of intro to CSS before we get into styling up this super awesome web page that I've thrown up for you guys. Okay. So so let's actually go back. Last night I gave you kind of a model of how to think about every single language that you learn. The first question you should be asking is, what am I trying to solve, and is this the right language for it? So if our goal is to style this page, then CSS is absolutely the language we want. The next question you would ask is, how do I write CSS? What are the keywords and the syntax? And we'll be spending a lot of time talking about that tonight. But I'm going to pull back up that code base and just give you a little example. Let's actually, sorry, I have the full code base somewhere here. 1 second. There it is. Okay, so here's that full code base. So a little basic intro to how we think about CSS is that there are 3 parts of it. We're always saying, what do we want to, or what element do we want to style? What part of the element do we want to style, and how do we want to style it? For example, these 3 lines are all about, I want to style all my H1s. I specifically want to change what font family I'm dealing with, so that's like the type of font, and I want to change that to cursive. Or maybe over here, I want to take all my paragraphs, I want to change the font size on them, and I want to change it to 20 pixels. Over here, I'm saying I want to grab all my spans, I want to style the visibility, and I want to make them hidden, which we can see that when we go over here that all my spans are in fact hidden. And my H1 has a cursive font family, so there it is in action. So I'll get into the nitty-gritty details of the syntax in just a minute, but it's all part of this idea of what element do we want to style, what piece of it do we want to style, and how do we want to style it. So that's the next piece of the puzzle, is how do we write our code? And then the final piece that we always have to ask is, how do we run our code? Remember that with HTML, we run HTML code by just opening it in the browser. So how do we run CSS? Well, we don't just open CSS in the browser, because CSS can't stand alone. An HTML page on its own will look bad, but it still makes sense. But CSS is dependent. Think of it as like a leech. It needs to leech off of the HTML in order to gain its life force. So CSS doesn't work on its own. So the way we run CSS is we actually link it into our HTML. And this, what I'm about to show you here, isn't need to know for this intro course, but it's a good thing to think about. So right here on line 5, I've actually linked in my style sheet. You don't need to know how to do this, but if you want to play with writing code bases on your own, you will have to look up a little more on how to do this. So I just want to make you aware that this is here and it's important, but fortunately we don't have to worry about it, and that's because we are in CodePen. And CodePen has this magical little property that linking happens behind the scenes. We don't have to manually put anything in. It assumes that anything that goes down here in the CSS tab is going to be linked to the HTML up there. So another wonderful thing about CodePen, apart from the fact that it will auto-display your sites, is that it will auto-link your CSS into your HTML. All right, so there is a little bit on how we think about CSS. Let's go ahead and dive into how to write it. So as mentioned, we're always going to grab, or let me actually just clear out all the CSS we have up here and start from scratch. So the first thing we start with is what's called a selector. So a selector says, what do we want to style? And for starters, we're just going to use element selectors. So we could type out div. That says, I want to style all of the divs on the screen. So that is a element selector. We've just selected all the divs. After a selector, we do 2 curly brackets. And some syntax conventions is we would put a space here, have the first curly bracket start on the same line, and the next one be on its own line. Once again, you'll probably just want to look at some code examples so you can get used to the white space and tabbing here. So we start out with a selector, and then inside of our selector, we're going to have pairs. These are called property and value pairs. So what we'll be doing is saying the property is what do we want to style on these divs? What do we want to change about the divs? And the value is how do we want to change it? So we're going to start with something really simple, which is color. So color refers to text color. So color, let's go ahead and say blue. Now everything just turned blue because everything is inside of the div. So that wasn't that interesting, but what if we changed our selector instead to LI, list item? Now notice that only the list items turned blue. If we change this instead to H5, now all the H5s turned blue. So color is a built-in property in CSS. That means it's something that is built in. We can't, for example, if we said text color, that doesn't exist. So now nothing happens with our code. We have to know what property names refer to what. And once again, you don't have to memorize them because they're all online. In fact, I have color pulled up here. So what's really cool is that not only will the documentation on MDN tell me what the name of the property is, it will explain how it works, and then it'll give me a bunch of examples of the types of values I can put in. So for color, we can just type out the name of some colors, and there are built-in colors that we'll recognize. We can use a hex code, which is a way that we could actually put in something a bit more specific. Like if we wanted to find just the perfect shade of purple, we could go Google a hex picker and find our exact shade we wanted and put in the hex code. We can specify the red, green, blue values. I am totally spacing what HSL stands for. I think it's like hue, I'm embarrassing myself here. So there are some other options. I usually just do either the color name or the hex color. That works pretty well for me. But other developers have other preferences. So, so there's a little look, hue, saturation, lightness, once again, saved by the audience. See, I don't need to know that much stuff because you guys are just a massive compendium of knowledge. And whenever I don't know something, you just feed it into me, and that's great. Cool. All right. And okay, so that is color. That is one of the most basic properties that you can work with. It just changes the text color. All right, and then, so let's look at a couple other attributes. A related one to color is background color. So let's go ahead, and that was something I did with the spans. Actually, I'm gonna do it with the divs. So if I want to change the background color on my divs, I might go ahead and put in background dash color. And then let's set that to pink. So now all of a sudden, all my divs have a nice little background color on them. So that's pretty cool. We can now, where our divs were kind of invisible before, it's pretty obvious where they are now. So, and if we wanted to change the background color on something specific, like our H3s, we could do background color, even turn it back to white. And now all of a sudden, those turned white again. That's not, I'm gonna change that to light blue, actually. There we go. So not super pretty. We've got kind of this like baby shower flag chic look going on right now. But it'll give you an idea of what's going on. And what's cool about this is you can really see where the element exists. For example, we can now see that the H3 elements actually, and the div elements actually extend to the entire edge of the screen. Whereas if I did span background color, I will do, let's do green. This is gonna get even more ugly. So if I did green, we can see that spans are actually a little smaller by default. So we really get a clear idea of how big our elements actually are when we add things like background colors or borders on. So there you go. There are two things you can do with CSS. Let's play around with some more. Some other properties I wanted to show you are height and width. So actually that's very relevant to what I just brought up. We can see by default that divs extend to the end of the screen, but we might want to change that. We could change that with width and set that equal to, let's say, 300 pixels. Now my divs just got a lot more narrow. So pixels are one option for width. We can also do percentages, like we could do 50%. And so it really is actually a very sophisticated thing to deal with things like height and width, because what looks good on your monitor probably won't look good on my monitor and definitely won't look good on my cell phone screen. So while we want to start off by, it's totally fine to start off by hard coding in pixel amounts for our height and width and other things, just keep in the back of your mind that when we actually get into the real world of CSS, we need to be a little more sophisticated to make sure that things work for all screen sizes. That's called responsiveness, and we spend a lot of time on responsiveness in the main curriculum, but apart from this little shout out to it, we don't really cover it in this intro course because we want to get the groundwork in place for that. All right, so there's width. Very similar to width is height. So this is gonna look really bad on, actually I'm gonna change height on my H3s. So if I wanna make my H3s a little taller, I might say height, let's say 80 pixels. And now all of a sudden my headers are quite a bit taller. So there's another attribute we might change. I'm gonna get rid of that one though because it looks truly awful. Tonight's class should be called How to Make the Ugliest Website in the World. So you'll have plenty of opportunity to make your own horrendously ugly website in the homework tonight. Okay, next I want to talk to you about border. So border is slightly more complicated. There's a lot of different options for how we can create border. So on the most basic level, we can just type in a style. So for example, solid, and it'll put on a solid border, or dashed. There's also dotted. But we also have the option to, wow, that looks really bad. We also have the option to add in things like the thickness or the color. So if we wanted to, we could say 1 pixel, solid black. And it does have to be in that order: thickness, style, color, or red, if we wanted to make it red for some reason. For a full list of things we can do with border, check out the documentation. So yeah, we can actually even do if we want to leave out the size, there's like a bunch of different options for things we can do with border. I usually try and stick with actually specifying all 3 of these, so I feel like I have some say in what's going on with my border. But you're welcome to check out that documentation on MDN and play with different ways that you can add a border in. So the next thing I wanted to talk to you about is font size. Pretty straightforward. I talked to you last night about headers and how by default your H1 is going to be the biggest and so forth, but I told you last night not to get too attached to that idea, and this is why. So we can see that by default our H5s are definitely smaller than our H3s, but I could change that if I wanted to. So I'm going to say font size 30 pixels for my H5. Now my H5s just got huge. So don't get attached to this idea of H1 is the biggest, because really all that styling should be happening on your own. So think about H1 as being the most important, because with the help of CSS, you can always change the size of anything, including your headers. So let's make those a little more manageable. We can also make them super tiny if we wanted to. Let's make them 16. Okay. So the last thing I want to talk to you about in terms of properties that you might use are a couple of properties that are part of something called the box model. So to start, you might have noticed that something kind of awful is going on here, where our divs are all squished together. It looks really bad. On that note, we can also see that all our text is squished over to the side. So we can fix that with something called margin and padding. Let's start with margin. So if we change the margin on our divs, that has to do with everything that exists outside of the div. So I'm going to throw on a margin of 20 pixels. So now there's 20 pixels worth of space around the top, the side, and the bottom. Similarly, if I want to create some space inside of my div, that's padding. So we'll do padding, not passing. So we'll just do 5 pixels of padding. So now there's just a little bit of space in between the edge and where the elements start. And with that background color on the headers, it's really obvious to see that there's a little pink strip on each side. So margin and padding are super important. There's something that we really take for granted, but they really are a key part of what makes websites readable and aesthetically pleasing, and they're an important part of conceptualizing how large an element is. So this is called the box model, and I have a little image of this. So whenever you're asking yourself, how much space on the page does my element take up, you have to think about several different things. For starters, you have whatever padding is around the outside. You have whatever thickness of border you might have. There's the, or did I say padding? Margin around the outside, the thickness of the border, the padding on the inside, and then finally the content inside of it. So in order to conceptualize a full HTML element, you have to take all of these pieces into account. The element doesn't really end where the border is. It includes the margin around it. So this is just a nice little visual tool to help you remember what's the margin, what's the padding, how does it all fit together. Just Google the box model if you're curious about this or if you want to learn more about it. But it really just refers to this idea that every HTML element is a box that includes things like margin, padding, border, content. So that is it for the CSS elements I will be teaching you tonight. As it was the case with HTML as well, there are a bunch. Here's a gigantic list of CSS elements. You will recognize some of them. You will not recognize most of what's on here. See with the border, there's like a bajillion different things you can do with the border. Like half the page is just border properties. So don't worry about these right now. Master the ones I've taught you. Play around with the documentation on those. But if you're feeling bored or curious or maybe a little masochistic, go ahead and look up this list. It's just pretty easily accessible on MDN if you look up CSS. And you can maybe play with a couple properties I did not introduce tonight. So there you have it. Those are some CSS properties. So I hope you guys don't think that we're done with the lecture because things are just about to get interesting. As it were, the selector I've taught you, which is that we select based on element, is a little crude. Notice that I had to style all of the div elements, and I had to style all of the divs exactly the same. Same with all of my H3s are exactly the same. My H5s, the same. That's not very sophisticated. It would be extremely difficult to make a dynamic, beautiful website if you were limited to styling all the divs the same and so forth. So there's a interesting way to do this. So let's say that we wanted to style a single item. Let's say that we wanted to style our grape list item purple. So how would we select that? Because we know that if we just did LI color purple, that would style all 8 LIs, but we just want the grape. So it turns out that there are some other selectors we can use. And in this case, we're going to use what's called a ID selector. ID selectors are used when you want to style a single item uniquely. And to start, we actually have to put an ID on inside of our HTML. So let's go up to our HTML and find our friend the grape. And we are going to put on an attribute, just like we use when we're creating links and images. But this attribute is going to be called ID. And ID is set equal to anything we want to call it. So I'm going to actually ID this grape. Not that interesting, but pretty clear. We want to come up with ID names that are obvious. So now I have ID'd my grape with the ID of grape. So instead of selecting based on element, I can select based on ID. And we use a hashtag to do that. So it's just like social media. We just use hashtags. So I use hashtag followed by my ID name, and notice that now my grape has been styled. Ta-da! I just styled a single element. Here's something even cooler about IDs. Let's say we wanted to style our night 1 differently. So let's say we wanted night 1 to have a different colored background. I'm going to give this an ID of, I'll call this first header. So ID first header. And down here, I'm going to grab it with a hashtag. And then let's make the background color red instead. Whoa. Okay, so something to note here. I mean, we can see that it worked like the grape. You know, we ID'd it up in the HTML, and then we grabbed it with a hashtag down here, and we changed the color to red. But there's something interesting going on, which is that there's two contradictory bits of code. Down here, I say background color light blue for H3s. Up here, I say background color red for hashtag first header. So it turns out that there is a hierarchy when it comes to selectors. That hierarchy has to do with the selector itself. So as it were, ID tags are the most important. They have #1 priority. So whatever other styling you have, a ID tag is going to take precedent. It's going to override any other styling. So that's why the color red won over the color blue. So there's a little bit about IDs. The next thing I want to show you are called classes. So let's say that we wanted to style both our mango and our peach orange because they are both orange. So we can't use an ID because IDs are unique. Only one element can have an ID. And so we could give mango its own ID and peach its own ID, but that's a little redundant. So instead we're going to use classes. So classes are added in a very similar way to IDs. We just use the attribute of class, and we might throw in orange, which is kind of confusing since orange is also its own fruit, but that's neither here nor there. And then we could go down here, and this time we'll select it using a dot. So we would do dot orange to say, look for a class called orange, and I want to set that color to orange. And they're pretty hard to read on that pink background, but there you go. We could even, if we wanted to, change the background color to black. Yeah, that looks nice and ugly. Nice. So we styled the background and the text color using a class of orange. And what's cool about this is we don't actually have to limit ourselves to the type of elements we might use. For example, if we wanted, for some reason, our spans, or let's say we also wanted, I'm trying to think of what would be a good example. Let's say we wanted the title of fruit list to also be orange for some reason. We could put this up here on our H5. We could say class equals orange. And it would change. So we're not limited. The takeaway here is that we don't have to only use this class on LIs. This class could go on any different type of elements. Anything we want to have this orange style, we just throw the orange class on and it will override whatever's there. So we can see that once again, this overwrote the code down here that says to make the color blue. So it turns out there's still a hierarchy here. So these tag selectors that I showed you at the beginning are the least important. Next, we have classes. Those will take the next priority. And then finally, IDs will be the highest priority. And I have a little image here to help you remember. So here's what the tag selector, the HTML syntax is just normal. And then we select just by saying the name of the element. And this is going to be the third priority. Next, with a class, we have to add a class attribute in HTML. We then select it using dot notation, and then that's the second priority. So it will override tag selectors, but it won't override IDs. Finally, with IDs, we would put an ID on in the HTML, and then we use a hashtag to select, and this is going to be our top priority. So this is just a little window into why CSS can get really confusing. It turns out, I think CSS might be the most challenging part of all of web development, but then again, I'm like a math nerd, so making things look pretty kind of scares me, and algorithms I'm like right at home with, but I think that there's a pretty big consensus that CSS is a very subtle art, and the reason is all these selectors. So things can get crazy. You can, if you want, for example, select a tag and a class together. So now this only styles things that are LIs with the class of orange. You can even do multiple selectors. So you could do H5 and span on the same thing. And now the spans just changed a little bit. So yeah, so things can get pretty crazy here. Or wait, sorry. It would be H5 comma span. And now we're styling both H5s and spans with this font size and this color of blue. Man, that blue on green looks terrible. So there are lots of different options. There are a ton of selector things that I'm not showing you here. Once again, don't get bogged down, but Google it if you're curious. And the final little insight I want to give you into this is I'm actually going to do some inspecting. Remember inspecting from yesterday? So now that we have a little bit of insight, let me actually, specifically inspect this element. So we were mostly looking at HTML last night with the inspecting, but we can look at CSS too. So check this out. Here's a list of all the styling on this header. But if we scroll down, we can see all the reject styling. Look at that. There's tons of styling coming from all over the place. A lot of it's been crossed out. That means that it's overwritten at some point. So when you look at an actual code base with, a website on it, there's going to be tons of styling. And all the styles are always competing to see who wins. So that's really one of the key skills when you're learning CSS, is being able to conceptualize how our styles ranked. And there's a homework assignment tonight designed just to test you on that. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk to you about before I go over the homework and then answer questions are frameworks. So frameworks have been kind of mentioned subtly yesterday, but I don't think I really talked about what they were. So here's a little spoiler alert. It turns out that people generally do not just write raw CSS when they're styling a website out in the world. Nor do people write raw JavaScript when they're building a website out in the world. They use things called frameworks. So frameworks aren't exactly new languages. They're more like an add-on that you put on top of a language to make it even more powerful. So people have built these CSS frameworks, things like Bootstrap, which you'll learn in the main curriculum, or Materialize or Foundation. And they're all extra special, awesome things that make it even easier to write CSS. For example, I mentioned responsiveness. Responsiveness was this idea of your website should look good on a phone and on a desktop and on a laptop and on a tablet. So one of many reasons that these frameworks are so powerful is because they make things like responsiveness way easier. So we will not be covering any frameworks in this course. And I would say that it is extremely important that you learn how to write raw CSS before you can get really good at a framework like Bootstrap. So we will be covering raw CSS in this course, and you'll start with raw CSS in the main curriculum, and then you'll learn things like Bootstrap. And another piece of the puzzle is there's also something called preprocessors, which are also a really important part of it. So I just wanted to introduce you to those ideas for two reasons. One is I want you to get used to these terms so that when people are talking about things, you're not like, ugh, I don't know what they're talking about. The other reason is to just give you a little taste of what's to come. So have fun with the raw CSS tonight, but also take some solace in knowing that it gets easier once you add in things like Bootstrap. Oh, I see someone is saying that Flexbox is way better than Bootstrap. Yeah, there are downsides to frameworks as well. They kind of force you to style your site in a certain way. So yeah, so I will say I like Bootstrap a lot because I don't like CSS that much. But if you want something really customized and you want a lot of power and control over what you're creating, then you don't have to use a framework. Some people would choose to just write CSS itself. So that's a little bit on frameworks for you. Now I am going to go ahead and jump into the homework just to show you what you have to look forward to tonight. So, and I also want to apologize. I misspoke last night about your project managers. You'll have the links to the homework via the syllabus. They'll also be emailed to you. They'll also be posted in Slack. So you will have many places to find the homework links. As a reminder, make sure you fork the homework and save it. And then your project managers will be assigned to you around 7 o'clock so that you can get into groups and review everything. So anyways, here we have 3 assignments for tonight. The first one is all about reading code. So do not uncomment your CSS. Your job is to go through and actually, let's see. Yes, your job is to go through and answer these questions about this code. It's going to ask things like, what would the text color be? So if you look at this header, step 1, you have to figure out what's the text color and what's the background color just by reading the code. So it's really easy to cheat on this. You just have to uncomment out the CSS, but I'm assuming that you are here because you want to learn, so don't do it. Read the code and try and figure it out. It's challenging, but it'll force you to start to think about these things like priorities. So you can go through it, and then at the end, you can go ahead and comment things out and check your work. So that's assignment 1. Assignment 2 is also all about selectors, but you get to actually write code. So your job, and I will say, this is a lot more interesting, don't edit the CSS that's here. Don't edit the selectors. Just add properties and values here. And try to get the text on screen to match the description. So this should be red text with a blue border. This should be green text with a white background. So try and write your code so that it matches this. And it's a little trickier than it sounds because of things like IDs and classes. The last assignment is pretty free form. This is part of your making the ugliest websites in the world goal. If you can make a not ugly website, kudos to you. But based on what I've taught you tonight, it'd be pretty hard to make something that doesn't look like circa 1999. So this is pretty free form. You just have to create a website for a business. There's some requirements about the HTML and CSS that you have to use, but beyond that, have fun, get creative, make things weird. So there are your 3 assignments for tonight. As a reminder, you don't need to submit them, just fork them and save them, and we will have access to them. And another question that I get a lot at the beginning is about grading and reviewing the homework. We don't formally grade these. So with these CSS, HTML assignments, it should be pretty easy to tell if it's working or not because you can see what's on the screen. Unfortunately, we don't have time to actually go through and give all you guys a grade or feedback, but if you have a question about something in particular, we would love to hear it. So please ask in Slack or bring it up with your group or even message me directly if you'd like. All right, so those are the 3 assignments for tonight. I will now be answering any questions you have, and then I will set you loose on the world. Okay, there's a question about course ID for the attendance link. Unfortunately, I don't deal with all the housekeeping stuff like that, so I'm not quite sure if I can answer your question, Connor. I apologize. And I don't believe we're taking attendance each night either, but they might have changed that on me, unprepared. So I would message either Mitchell Wright or Thomas Dillard in Slack about anything attendance related, and they can help you out. Question about forking. You need to fork before you start the homework. So you can't edit and save. I think you can edit, but you can't save until you fork. So make sure you fork first. Great question. Okay, we have a question about actually getting into Lambda School. So yeah, there are 2 steps. I was going to talk about this a bit more tomorrow, but I'll talk about it right now. So there are 2 steps to being admitted to Lambda School. The first is that you do have to pass a challenge. So we have a JavaScript challenge. It covers topics that we will all cover in this course. So if you are new to JavaScript, I would wait until you're finished with this course to take that challenge. If you have JavaScript experience or experience in another programming language, you might be able to take it sooner. Once you pass the challenge, you will then get an interview. So the interview, you won't be whiteboarding or coding in the interview. It's more of a culture fit. We want to make sure that you're serious about this, you're dedicated to it, and that you're someone who can work well with others. So those are the 2 pieces, is know some basic JavaScript and let us know why you're serious about Lambda School. That's about all there is to it. Ask Karen Zachary in Slack if you have any other questions. I have a question about my accent. I think I saw this last night but didn't answer. I'm surprised you brought that up because I didn't know I had an accent, but I guess everyone feels that way. I'm from Utah originally, but my parents are both from the Midwest, so it's probably Utah with like a little bit of Chicago mixed into it. I don't know. Okay. We asked a question about CodePen. One thing I want to say is I've had a couple people ask about the paid version of CodePen. Don't pay for CodePen. You don't need to pay for CodePen. Just use the free version. As far as the view, you can change the view if you like. I really like having the panels on the side. It's just my preference. I think by default they're on the top. Just play with that and do whatever you want, whatever feels comfortable to you. The next question, unfortunately, is one that I also can't answer about how many students are typically in one class in Lambda. Unfortunately, I don't have insight into that because I only teach this intro class, but that would be a great question to ask Karen. And feel free to post about it in Slack once you get the answer. So I apologize that I do not have the answer to that. I might actually look into that myself in case anyone is wondering about that in the future. We have a post that says, oh, about 60. Okay, cool. So about 60 people. Thank you, Alex. Okay, we have a question about homework moving forward. So yes, CodePen will be used tonight, but from here on out, or starting tomorrow and for the rest of the course, we'll use a different environment called Replit. And so Replit is a little better for programming languages. So we'll start using Replit tomorrow, and I will talk all about Replit. You should have already created a Replit account. If you haven't for some reason, that is something you will need to do. All right. As far as the Lambda challenge, you can take that Lambda challenge whenever you are ready. You could request it immediately after this lecture tonight if you feel like you're prepared. So the only reason to wait on it is if you don't have much exposure to JavaScript and you need some time to ramp up. I have a question about what IDE do I use? So I like to I'll start by telling everyone what an IDE is. So an IDE is basically a fancy text editor that has a bunch of built-in extra stuff. So my old company provided JetBrains for free. So there's a bunch of different IDEs depending on language. I can't even remember what they were called. I was using the version for Ruby, the version for JavaScript, and for Python. So I used something called JetBrains, but I literally used it because my company provided it for free. So IDEs tend to be, you have to pay for them usually, but they're pretty nice because they allow you to see what's really, if you look at one piece of code and highlight it, you can see where else it's being used in the entire code base. So there's a little view into IDEs, but honestly, I usually just program in Sublime because I'm old school like that. There is a question about, another question I don't know the answer to. You guys are putting me on the spot tonight. First the backsplash, now this. So the question is, can you take the Lambda challenge more than once? I believe that you can, but I don't know what the limit is on that. So if anyone wants to throw an answer in chat, who knows, they can. But otherwise, I would talk to Karen Zachary about that to get a little more insight into that. All right, I think I'm going to wrap up the Q&A. We haven't really gotten any questions actually about HTML or CSS. So if anyone has any HTML, CSS related questions, I will give you a little window of opportunity to ask those. Otherwise, I want to let you guys get loose and work on the homework tonight. Okay, a question, can we use CSS Grid? So CSS Grid is something that's a little more advanced that we didn't cover tonight, but is a very useful tool for making your site look not ugly. So I would say that if you feel really comfortable with everything we learned tonight, and if you have completed all the requirements, do whatever you want with your site. If you know about CSS Grid, use it. If you're feeling ahead and have never heard of CSS Grid, feel free to Google it. So you have to actually meet all the requirements, but beyond that, you can do whatever you want with your business site for tonight. As far as learning how to set images to the background, yeah, so you can add a background image if you want, instead of just a background color. This is actually our last night of CSS, so we won't be doing any more CSS in this intro course. We will definitely cover background images in the main curriculum, and I would put that in the same category as grids, that if you are comfortable with everything we did, go ahead and Google it and see if you can set a background image. So there's lots of opportunity to challenge yourself if you want. Okay, here's a question about selectors. This looks interesting. Let me, all right. So the question is, why would we use an ID instead of a class with just one element? And does a CSS selector that chooses a class, an element, overwrite one that just selects a class? Okay, two great questions. So the reason why we would use an ID is because of the priority. That's the main reason. So when we use an ID selector, it's going to be prioritized to the max. It's also a good way to guarantee that no one else will try and put that ID on a different element. So if we just had a class on a single element, someone else, our fellow developer might put it somewhere else. Another priority question is, I'm just actually going to wipe this atrocious thing and show you something real quick. So here, I'm going to do 2 paragraphs. Paragraph 1 and paragraph 2. So let's say that we had a class of, let's do, wait a minute. Sorry, I'm trying to think of how to set this up to answer this question. Sorry, one second. So if I'm going to put actually 2 classes on here. So I'm going to have a class called C1 and a class called C2. So this isn't something we explored really tonight yet, which is what if we have 2 classes on something? So if I had C1, dot C1, this is a little beyond the scope of the question, but I think this is a useful thing to see. So if we have C1 says color red and C2 is color blue, who is going to win? Well, oh wait, sorry, my syntax is wrong. I can tell it's getting to the end of the night. If you have 2 classes on something, you just have one class attribute and then they both go inside the quotes with a space. Okay, so we have 2 classes on this currently, which is totally allowed. Things will have many classes. So who is going to win because classes are prioritized equally? Well, cascading in Cascading Style Sheet means it goes from top to bottom. So the bottom color will win by default, or whatever the lower style is, if all else is the same. But one way we might give this guy a little more priority is if we threw on the element. So to answer that question, yes, a selector that contains a tag and a class will be prioritized over a class by itself. So there's a little something to chew on. Okay. My goodness, now you guys are asking a ton of questions about CSS. Let's see. Why would we, okay. Well, I think that might be, there's a question about marquee tags. I will let you Google that and figure out what marquee tags do if you want. Okay, cool. So I think I am going to set you guys loose. Make sure you have enough time for the homework. So that is it for tonight's lecture. All right, tomorrow we will start on JavaScript. So we're changing courses a bit tomorrow, and we're going to start on JavaScript and then be doing that for the rest of the week and all of next week. So have fun with the styling tonight. Make some nice late 90s style sites for me, and then I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great night.